Much of the luster that had dwelled within Shanita's eyes had dulled. She stared at the ground, and her mouth formed a twisted frown. She couldn't even meet Masai's gaze, and a rippling sense of falling danced in Masai's chest.
I knew I would grow dimmer.
The falling sensation increased in force, as if he plummeted faster and farther into an imaginary chasm. He tried to smile, yet his mouth refused to comply. Instead, he beamed an awkward kind of open-mouthed expression at her. As soon as Shanita saw it, she winced.
What happened?
Shanita's shoulders sank a little more, and the wrinkles in her face appeared to grow more defined. A great weight had settled upon the older woman, and in turn it dragged down on Masai as well. After many moments of averted gazes, she slowly locked eyes with him.
I saw my greatest act of mercy. Let's just say it wasn't my finest moment. I saw more than that too.
What do you mean? What else could you have seen?
Her eyes became more moist, and yet she didn't cry like before.
I saw all of the moments where I could have shown mercy to people, and I didn't. As I went through my life, I thought everything was so hard. So I never allowed myself to share the blessings I had with other people. I only cared about me and my family. There was so much good I could have done.
I had no idea that you would see all of your missed opportunities of mercy. The lore never even hinted at something like that.
Masai's skin itched with raking, stabbing tingles. Shanita averted her eyes again, and she let out a small sigh.
Do you regret not helping the man from before?
Before Masai answered, Shanita moved forward.
Let's go. I want this to be over one way or another. I'm so glad you're here to help me. Otherwise, I'd have ended up like one of the crazed ones.
Masai followed her quietly, all the while clutching his staff. His steps were heavy, although not as heavy as his heart. Flashes of himself leaving the rich man behind danced in the forefront of his mind. The echoes of the man's screams taunted him over and over. For the next couple of miles, neither he nor Shanita said anything. What thoughts and regrets coursed through the mind of the old woman? Masai swallowed and hoped the acid bile that had pooled at the back of his throat wouldn't spill out past his lips. How many mercies did Masai willingly abandon in hopes to serve his own interest? For the most part, Masai was a good person. At least, he thought he was. Surely he was. Wasn't he? When Shanita and Masai made it over the top of a rocky ridge, they stopped. Shanita stared open-mouthed and wide-eyed at the spectacle. Masai did his best to hide his astonishment. Although, to be honest, both things were quite amazing in their own ways. The first amazing thing was the next gate. Rather than be a vertically upright archway, the fourth gate had its own special design. A humongous pit lay in the center of the valley floor, and a thick golden ring carved with glyphs outlined its edge. Blackness that surpassed even the most desolate nights filled the interior of the pit. The second amazing thing sent violent shivers throughout Masai's core. A legion of tall, skeletal figures stood in the open ground before the gate. Each of the figures had to have been over 6 feet tall. Ominous spikes protruded from their bones like natural spiked armor. Every time one of the creatures moved, it groaned in agony. The creatures' hands were vicious claws, and massive fangs jutted from their mouths. They had no eyeballs, but had magical fires burning in the empty spaces. Shanita whimpered a little.
What in Dia's name are they?
Dread coated Masai's words.
I'm willing to bet my life those are the punished. They're said to be very dangerous,
Masai gestured to the small army with a hand.
This is why people spend their entire life savings to purchase guardians for their journey.
There has to be 100 of those things down there. Will your staff work against them?
Masai gave out a nervous chuckle.
More like 200. As for my staff, I have no idea. This is my first trial of the Acolyte. I hope it'll work.
Shanita's voice wavered with anxious vibrations.
So what are we going to do?
What were they going to do indeed? Masai took in a reassuring breath, and then he started to move closer to the gate. He took soft, silent steps and watched the edge of the punished with keen attention. At the moment, none of them had noticed Masai or Shanita yet. The punished were just standing about, gazing around lazily, as if plagued by both boredom and annoyance. He glanced over his shoulder. Shanita mimicked his movements, but she resembled a terrified rabbit. Was that mirroring Masai's expression too? Maybe. His words were whispers.
We'll keep on going for the gate, like we originally planned. You did dim a little, and I don't know if the punish will be repelled in the same way as the other monsters. Also, remember what the first set of jackals said? The punish will try to absorb you.
Absorb me? What does that even mean? And what does that mean for you?
He simply shrugged and then turned his attention to the punished. Step by step, they crept ever closer, and still the punished had not noticed him. However, in his determined focus, Masai's foot hit a loose stone. Before he realized it, he had tumbled down the slight incline, rolling closer to one of the punished. Damn it! Was it his imagination, or did he let out an oof? One by one, the punished slowly whirled around and stared at him. Dia damn it. One of the punished pointed a jagged finger at Masai, and its jaws opened a little. Now that he was this close, Masai saw the perfectly savage teeth that made up the punished mouths. An unholy screech rippled. Masai placed his hands over his ears and slowly got to his feet. More punished looked his way, followed by a haunting chorus of shrills and roars. Shanita crouched beside him, and she sniffled as new tears fell from her cheeks. The punished stepped forward, but then abruptly stopped. They swung their hands at the invisible barrier, but it prevented their limbs from getting closer too. More and more tried to bash in the bubble, and they surrounded Masai and Shanita. They climbed on top of one another, but they couldn't get any closer. When Masai and Shanita started moving, immense force gently pushed the punished back and away from them on the edge of the bubble. This only pissed off the punished more, and they slammed their fists harder. Masai smiled a little until the first crack of energy formed on the bubble. A deep coldness overtook him, and he gazed around at the other punished. More cracks had formed, and they splintered up and down the magical barrier. The punished screamed out constantly, and Masai's head buzzed with aggravation. Shanita was saying something to him, but her words were lost in the storm of screeches. Wild urgency fluttered in him, and he glanced all about as cracks continued to get worse. If he didn't do something quick, the bubble was going to pop. Masai tightened his jaw and he leapt forward. He struck one of the punished in the face and sent energy into it. To his surprise, the single punished stopped screaming and it stepped back. The other punished beside him also stopped, and they watched the first one with unnatural intrigue. Masai couldn't look away either. Tiny fissure cracks stretched up each of the bones making up the punished's body. Black light illuminated from the cracks. A moment later, the punished exploded in a violent display of dust. Spiked barbs shot out everywhere in all directions. One of them grazed Masai's cheek. White-hot pain shook his nerves. Shanita let out a groan, and so Masai glanced back to her. She grabbed her shoulder, and she whimpered with anguished eyes. All around them, several of the punished kneeled down and held various parts of their bodies. Small little holes had been drilled into their bones, and from the holes, little fissures started to creep about. Eerie black light shimmered from the fissures.
Oh no. By everything that's holy, dodge!
Several large explosions thundered around them, and spiked shrapnel zipped all around Masai like a hail of arrows. One of the bone spikes penetrated Masai's shoulder, and another plunged into the back of his calf. He screamed out in agony. Shanita crumpled to the ground, and had little black holes all over her body. She didn't bleed, but her body shook. Bright-colored mist floated up from Masai's wounds. More of the punished started showing signs of shattering, and the surrounding punished who had not been affected tried to move away from those destined to explode. Masai closed his eyes as more punished exploded, which in turn caused more of their kind to become injured. Masai glanced over to the gateway, and his heart danced a little. A path had been created for the moment. He channeled his energy into his staff, and then he threw it into the crowd of the punished. As soon as the staff hit the monsters, the magic flowed into them. Moments later, their bodies began to fissure. Masai grabbed Shanita and placed her on his shoulders. Several more punished exploded and sent their barbs everywhere. Masai caught another spike in the back of his bicep and in the back of the thigh. Pain surged through his veins, but Masai kept running through the crowd of the punished. After his third or fourth step, the explosions began in mass, even more numerous than before. The very air rocked with one deafening boom after another. Sprays of barbs flew past Masai and wounded more of the punished. Shanita grunted again.
Stay with me, damn you!
Droves of punished were pushed aside as the bubble protecting Shanita forced them back. However, as they shifted, they became struck by other hails of shrapnel. Masai finally broke through the crowd, but another spike struck him in the back of the neck. The anguish almost caused him to drop Shanita. A pair of golden jackals stood by the edge of the great golden ring.
Only the dead.
Shut up!
Masai stopped at the edge of the gate and shook Shanita.
Open your eyes.
She blinked at him.
I'm in so much pain.
A barb flew between their faces.
Keep your eyes open at all times. Forgive me for what I'm about to do.
Masai picked her up and then tossed her into the black space between the ring. As she disappeared into the darkness, the glyphs flashed. Shanita watched him helplessly. She kept falling, and eventually, the blackness enveloped her. The walls of the pit were smooth and made from very dark stone. He crouched down in preparation to jump, but several barbs struck him at once. One dug into his left elbow. 2 more hit him in the lower back. His head swam with wooziness. More explosions rocked behind him. Masai took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and then jumped into the pit. Masai's stomach rushed up into his throat, and the savage wind created from opposing gravity blasted against his hair. Raw magical power trailed up through his limbs, through his chest, and through his toes. As soon as the arcane sensation had passed, Masai opened his eyes. Perhaps throwing Shanita down a hole as she drifted from consciousness to unconsciousness wasn't the most thought-out plan. Still, in the heat of the moment, what other choice did he have? As soon as he passed beyond the gate, Masai's descent slowed considerably. Granted, he still fell, but it was slow, casual, and significantly more enjoyable than it had been before. His stomach still swirled angrily at him, and his head swam a little. The tunnel was quite wide, perhaps 1,000 feet from end to end. and Masai floated in the very middle. Faint illumination was in the tunnel, although there wasn't a viable source for it. Splendid artwork covered the walls of the tunnel. The art consisted of elaborate reliefs and images of people doing various kinds of tasks. At first, the individuals and their actions seemed strange to Masai, but then he noticed one particular person. The figure represented the great master builder, Olia Nistaso, who had been famous for building the great library at Memphar. Though Masai had never seen the actual library, he had seen many other depictions of it on actual places. She had been one of the most famous people in Enonochian history. Were all the people depicted in the tunnel famous or prominent? Masai continued to fall, but he studied the people covering the tunnel walls. After an hour or so of falling, Masai finally came within view of the ground. Shanita stood there, waiting for him. As soon as they both noticed one another, they both waved wildly. Masai landed with a plop, and Shanita hugged him a moment later. She stepped back and gazed upon him.
Hey! You're standing upright. That's a good sign.
Several black circles dotted her skin, showing where she had been struck by the barbs. Shanita appeared unbothered by them now. He checked his own wounds. There were slight indentions in his skin, but touching them didn't cause any pain.
If you hadn't saved my soul, I'd be slapping the taste out of your mouth.
A small grin covered her face.
I was about to scream out when I realized I was falling, but then I stopped falling just as fast. I saw all of those lovely murals. I even think I saw my husband on those walls.
Really? Was your husband famous for something?
I suppose so. In his lifetime, he was a royal tomb builder. I really hope I can see him again.
Shanita pointed to the distance.
We're in a cavern, yet it's bright as daylight down here. There's a road made from golden bricks. Should we follow it?
Masai nodded.
Let's follow the golden path. That reminds me, you're even dimmer than the last time I saw you. I take it the gate of the greatest betrayal wasn't as positive as your first two gates.
The joy fell from Shanita's face, and she scowled darkly at Masai. It wasn't a scornful frown, but a disgruntled scowl.
If it's all the same to you, I'd like to keep that one private. I had to do something terrible to provide for my family. Something terrible. Against the one I loved most.
Masai simply nodded and then followed Shanita down the golden path. He took a deep breath. A wild, twisting kind of energy had appeared in his throat, right at the base. It pulsated continuously, and every time it did, Masai had the strong urge to laugh. Not because the situation was funny, but because if he didn't laugh, he would have bellowed in frustration. What had he gotten himself into? What could this woman have done to earn another dimming? Getting through the previous legion of punished had been hard enough, and now she was even more susceptible to the perils of the land of the dead. Would he truly be able to keep his promise? The cavern hallway ceiling hung 100 feet above their heads, and stalactites stretched down like teeth. Unnatural light filled the vast chamber, and every breath Masai drew in felt full of energy. Deep brown unworked cavern walls lined the golden bricked road, and every half mile or so, the golden bricked road veered to the right or the left. Throughout the last leg of the journey, Shanita kept to herself. It didn't really matter to him. He would still see her safely to the palace. Hopefully, it wouldn't be the last thing he ever did. The road entered a vast open area with a pair of humongous lakes on either side. The last golden archway stood at the very far end of the chamber. Each of the lakes had water that swirled with bright colors. An odd alien scent danced on the air. Most of the scent had floral undertones with slivers of sour slipping in and out of it.
Oh my, it's so wonderful.
Shanita's eyes had become glassy, and they almost shimmered with the same radiance as the lakes. A goofy grin had covered her face. Her pupils dilated so much that they nearly engulfed her irises.
You alright?
Masai approached her and touched her face. Fire dwelled beneath her skin, and a thin sheer of sweat had started to bubble up.
I'm wonderful. I never smelled such wonderful fragrances before. And look at all the people. They're dancing and singing.
Shanita swayed a little as she stood. Her eyes focused on one of the lakes. Masai turned to view the lakes, but he only saw swirling colors.
People? What are you talking about? We're alone.
Shanita frowned at him.
Are you kidding me? Do you see all of the tents and stages? This reminds me of the festivals back in Erd.
Masai gently took her arm.
There are no tents or stages. I only see the lake and the gate. The end of our journey is right there. We're almost done. Come.
Shanita squinted.
By the goddess Dia. It's him.
It's who? Who do you see?
A tightness grew in Masai's stomach.
It's my husband.
Shanita moved closer to the lakes.
He's on one of the stages and he's waving at me. I have to go to him.
Masai held her steady and braced himself. Shanita stopped abruptly, and then she looked down to Masai's tight grip on her arm.
Stop! You're hallucinating or something. There's no stage. Your husband isn't really there. You're being tricked.
Tears welled up in her eyes.
But I see him. Just as I remember him. You can't stop me. Let me go.
Masai tightened the grip more, and he started pulling her closer to the gate.
I promised I would get you to the palace. I don't know what's going to happen if you go into that lake, but we're not going to find out. Please, let's just go to the gate.
Let go of me.
Shanita kicked him in the shin, hard. Blinding pain surged through Masai's senses, and he let go. In that moment, Shanita stumbled closer to the edges of the lake.
Gotas. Gotas, I'm coming for you. I love you.
Before she could leap into it, Masai grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back. Shanita yelped out, and she tried to wiggle away.
Forgive me, but I'm getting you to the palace.
In one swoop, Masai tossed the old woman so that she was on his shoulder. As he ran down the path towards the gate, Shanita kicked him and kneed him. Masai just kept running, but he glanced over at the lakes. Now that he was closer, he noticed one important detail. A thick, oily substance filled the lakes entirely, with faces floating within the goo. Pairs of slightly dark eyes floated above thin mouths. Hundreds, no, perhaps thousands of faces stared at Masai and Shanita as they passed.
Help me!
Don't leave us. Join us.
Over and over, messages and callings found their way into his ears. Their voices sounded only an inch away. Alongside their eerie requests, Shanita screamed out for her husband. A pair of golden jackals waited before the gate of the greatest regret. As he passed them, Masai closed his eyes and yelled out.
Keep your eyes open. Shanita, we're almost there.
The energy touched his skin, and Shanita screamed out with such intensity and pain. Masai set her down once they had passed through the gate and tried to catch his breath. She bawled as she sat there.
I'm so sorry, Gotas. Please forgive me. I regret it so much.
Shanita curled into a small ball, and she wailed loudly. Every time she gasped for air, she pushed her energy into her cries. Her body shook violently. Masai watched her for a moment, but then stopped when a massive, horse-sized jackal came around the corner. As soon as he saw it, Masai's eyes opened wide. The jackal locked gazes with him. Though he wasn't a small child anymore, the jackal was still larger than he was. Obsidian-colored fur stood on end. The jackal's ears were upward and pointed, and its amber eyes reflected with a shimmer of unique intelligence. The animal smelled of incense and ash. Masai stepped in front of Shanita, extended his arms out, and he braced his whole body. At first, the jackal peered at him, but then it let out a hearty, unnatural chuckle.
Stand down, Acolyte. I mean neither of you any harm. My name is Harika, and I'm one of the many guardians from my master's palace. It is my duty to stand over the fallen while she comes to terms with her regret.
Masai blinked at her.
You can talk? How do you know I'm an acolyte?
We can smell you. You have the scent of one who is still bound in another existence. She, on the other hand, had the scent of one who is trying to transition between existences.
Harika gestured behind her with her giant nose.
Make your way to the palace. Other guardians will guide you on the path to take.
Masai hesitated for only a moment before he bent down and started rubbing Shanita's back.
I'm going to go ahead, okay? We're really close to the palace, and this guardian will watch over you for the rest of your journey.
Thank you for helping me. You didn't have to, and yet you watched over me.
Shanita turned away from him and resumed her hard weeping. Masai rose and approached the jackal named Harika.
So, she'll be okay then?
Harika's eyes radiated with a softness that almost seemed familiar.
Yes, she'll be fine. Hurry up, Acolyte. You can only remain in this state for so long.
Masai started along the path when Harika called out to him.
You were in the Neferi necropolis 9 years ago, weren't you?
Masai turned around.
How did you know that?
The jackal smiled again.
I was the one who found you all those years ago. You have grown quite well since then. Be on your way.
Masai stared at the jackal a moment longer before continuing down the golden path again. After about a half-mile of walking, he stopped. A sudden spasm struck him, followed by a growing aura of frustration. He gave one forlorn glance back where Shanita no doubt still wailed. But then he started moving forward again.
No! Idiot! You wasted your chance. You have no time.
After another mile of walking, Masai came upon a large structure. Tall onyx columns lined the outer perimeter of the palace. Elaborate and colorful reliefs depicting the jackal-headed goddess, lording over the legions of the undead, covered the walls. The roof had been constructed with elaborate clay tiles, and the top of the palace stood high above Masai. Several large trees extended from the tiled patio that spanned the palace. Each of the trees had a dozen pieces of fruit hanging from their branches. A few jackals patrolled the palace grounds, while others lounged beneath the trees. As Masai made his way up to the palace grounds, all of the jackals turned their attention to him. Those under the trees rose to a stand, while the jackals who patrolled the area approached him with curiosity. The jackals resembled Harika: obsidian fur, mysterious amber eyes, and massive teeth.
You are an acolyte.
Follow me. I shall lead you to the master. You will not deviate from the path I take.
The male jackal padded off toward the palace, while the other jackals watched him with grim silence. Masai swallowed hard, and he did his best to keep in line with the larger creature. The jackal had longer strides, and he moved across the grounds with ease. Masai, on the other hand, felt only slightly winded by the time they reached the massive front entrance. The jackal stopped before the enormous set of doors. Jackal carvings had been etched into the wood's surface, portraying the proud creatures playing, sleeping, and running. As soon as the jackal stopped, the doors opened magically, and then the jackal moved inside. Once Masai had entered, the doors slammed behind him. Black marble spanned the interior of the floors, walls, and ceiling. Within the marble, living stars twinkled lightly, and it gave the corridor an otherworldly appearance. Bright red rubies and green emeralds outlined every one of the doors. The comforting smell of incense lingered in the air. Large fire pits stood spaced out in the hallways, which cast eerie shadows on the walls. Every time Masai's feet hit the marble, it created a hollow ring in the air. The Jackal's feet made no noise. Another set of ornately carved double doors lay at the end of the hallway. Large gemstones jutted from the wood, and gold outlined some of the carvings.
You will wait here until you are summoned.
Just as before, the doors opened magically, and the Jackal entered the chamber. Elegant tapestries hung on the walls, at least from where Masai could see. The incense smell intensified and appeared to originate from a source within the chamber. The Jackal's voice called out, though it spoke to someone else.
Master, another acolyte has come for your judgment.
A soft voice responded.
I hope this is the last one. I grow weary of the constant groveling. Send them in.
The tone of the woman's voice caught Masai's breath. Every word dripped in familiar inflection. His heart beat like a festival drum. Masai's blood became icy liquid. Perhaps it was merely his mind playing tricks on him. However, if it wasn't, the Jackal came to the door.
Enter, but stand in the white circle. Avert your eyes until you are spoken to. And do your best not to grovel. My master has expressed discontent.
Masai's eyes fell downcast, and he entered the room. Dark green tiles spanned across the floor. Had Masai not felt the hardness of the stone beneath his sandals, he would have assumed he stood in a great forest. He studied the tapestries in greater detail. Each one depicted a different landscape, and one of them appeared to be the desert lands of Enonoch. The images in the tapestries moved, as if reflecting the locations they depicted. In addition to the desert scene, there was an ocean, a thick forest, a region that had a completely white landscape, a region in the mountains, and a place that reminded Masai of the night's sky. A completely white circle made from tiles decorated the floor in front of him. An elevated throne sat several feet from the circle, and someone sat upon its seat. His eyes averted downward, but he recognized her in an instant. Every urge in him demanded that he peek up at the goddess, but he had his instructions. Masai took his place in the middle of the white circle. The goddess's soft voice called out.
So, you wish to be a cleric of Anakanti, do you? Let me behold you and gauge your worth. Gaze upon me so that I might see into your soul.
Masai viewed her in entirety. She wore an elegant black dress that had a neckline that fell just under her collarbone. The bottom of her dress trailed to her ankles. Long, raven hair cascaded down in front of her shoulders and stopped just under the curvature of her breasts. Her golden honey-colored skin ignited a fiery passion within him. She didn't have the face of a jackal, but of a woman. Her beautiful and ominous amber-colored eyes stood out the most, though, for they appeared just as wondrous as they had 9 years ago. Anakanti stared at him, or perhaps through him, with the critical eyes she was famous for. When he first walked up, she seemed bored and uninterested in him. As she viewed every moment that had made up his life to that point, her eyes widened. A small degree of delight appeared on her pleasant face.
You've grown quite handsome, Masai.